Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our community conversation about the COVID-19 crisis and how Indigenous communities have organized to get resources to the ground in their communities. We're really excited to have this wonderful panel with us today, and hope that this will share some new insights from our reports and give you some of the important context around the findings that we had from the people on the ground who've been making it all happen. My name is Eric Stegman. I'm the Executive Director of Native Americans in Philanthropy, and my family's from the Carry the Kettle First Nation, and I'm looking forward to a robust conversation. But before we get to that, I'd love to welcome one of our close partners to open us in a good way today, Shelley Means, with a blessing. Shelley?
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. My name is Shelley Means. I am Ojibwe and Lakota, and I live currently in the territories of the Puyallup people near Seattle in Tacoma, Washington. It's an honor to open our time together today. So thank you, NAP, for inviting me in to do this. I'll be sharing a blessing that I first heard offered by an Indigenous leader from Guyana. It touched my heart, and I share it today to bless our time because there will be some heavy things that we'll be talking about. And these conversations about Indigenous leadership and organizing in response to the COVID pandemic is so very, very critical. And I'll begin this blessing with trees. And I'm chuckling a little bit because I hope you can't hear in the background. I have a neighbor who's actually running a chainsaw all of a sudden. And so it's kind of ironic because my blessing begins with trees. Where there are trees, there is water. Where there is water, there is food. Where there's water and food, there is health. Where there is health, there is wisdom. Creator, bless us today with a gift of listening. Bless us with the knowledge of our ancestors and the imperative of our descendants, and a quietness of spirit as we take in the trees, the water, and the nourishment of this conversation when we return to our work in community, in organizing, in philanthropy. May the nourishment of this conversation inspire new partnerships and new ways of being together. In the language of my ancestors that I'm just beginning to learn, Aho Mitakuyasin, all my relations, and Chi Miigwech. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that beautiful way to open us today, Shelley. We really appreciate you sharing that with us, and I think sets an important tone for us in what we'll be discussing today. Just a brief overview of how our program is going to run today. We're going to go until the end of the hour here. And what we wanted to do was to really help bring out the community voice that we put together in this report. You'll be able to find this report at nativephilanthropy.org, and I believe the team will be sharing it in the chat box as well. I'm going to go over just a couple of the key highlights from the report itself, but today was less to focus on the data itself and more to hear the stories from the ground from our partners that we work with every day at Native Americans in Philanthropy. For those of you who don't know, we're a national coalition of tribal organizations, leaders, and other Native stakeholders working together with funders and other philanthropic partners to really shift the field so that the philanthropic sector is investing not just more in tribal communities, but more meaningfully in tribal communities and really supporting those on the ground who are doing this work. So we're excited to have you here today, and we're looking forward to a robust conversation, and we'll just pull up our first slide here to share some of our initial findings. Next slide, please. And the next one. So why did we do this report? I want to just first of all share that one of the things that NAP started to end up being in the center of was really being a bit of an air traffic control and resource partner for funders and tribal community organizations to connect with one another in a moment of incredible need. I had actually just started my job in mid-February, just a few weeks before this crisis hit. And I'm really glad that I was here with our other staff who were here so that we could do everything possible to identify all the different response fund efforts that were evolving around the country, to set up our COVID resource page, which is still on our website, and to just make sure that we were educating funders, that we were helping them direct funds to Native-led organizations across the country, and do what we could to really lift up and promote our tribal community partners. In doing that, we learned a lot, and we started to realize that, you know, we really should try to get a sense of how much funding is being raised by Native organizations. Too often, this is always framed as, what did philanthropy do to respond to tribal communities? Instead, we saw an amazing and inspiring set of organizations and individual leaders and mutual aid groups across the country organizing, really building on their own relations and cultural strengths to do what they needed to do to get philanthropy, to give them the resources to do that work the right way and the way that Native people wanted it done. So we really wanted to help change the narrative with this report. What we found is we went through all of the different response efforts that we could find that were being led by Native people. These were intermediary organizations, these were mutual aid organizations, new sort of hybrid coalitions that were working at getting a lot of different kinds of funds to the ground, and to just try to get a good sense of just how much funding is really being raised and led to the ground by Native people. And what we found was that by October 2020, we were able to identify just over $32.2 million that were raised by Native-led causes and organizations across the country to invest during this crisis. Next slide, please. Now, because this was just an effort with us just looking at everything that we could find through our different networks and what we were identifying on our COVID page, we were only able to look at a couple different angles with this kind of data. One of the things that really stood out was the difference between funding that was being raised through platforms like GoFundMe. Many of you may have seen and donated to a lot of these out there. And then what we'd consider sort of traditional organizational mechanisms. So those are, you know, funders and philanthropic organizations giving directly to 501c3 organizations across the country, or intermediary funders, collaboratives like our Native Voices Rising initiative with the Common Council Foundation, that were then routing that funding to smaller organizations and in communities across the country. And we found that of that 32 million, about 8.7 million that we could identify was being raised by Native-led GoFundMe platforms, which was really interesting. And just about 5 million was being raised through sort of traditional philanthropy going through organizations. Now, we know that we certainly weren't able to capture everything. This was everything that we could track down in that period through our networks and coalitions, but we thought this was a really important number, and that, you know, it's definitely more than this, but I think it's really says something that Native communities were able to raise and distribute over $32 million in that period. Next slide, please. We also obviously had a very strong representation of funding in the Southwest. In the early phases of the pandemic and beyond, there was a particularly disparate impact happening in communities like the Hopi Reservation and Navajo and other Pueblo communities across the Southwest. So a lot of funding was being distributed there. We also had efforts from some of the folks on our panel that were doing a lot to get media attention on their community's issues. The rest of the funding we weren't able to really splice in a way that we thought was meaningful because so much of the funding that was going through intermediary funders and to regional and national organizations was actually coming from funders that either fund nationally or fund in different regions. So as we would like to have been able to look at a more specific picture of how much was going to each region, but it just wasn't possible at the time we did the report. But that multi-regional funding was going into a lot of different places across the country. Next. One of the things that we really wanted to do in the report was to get a better understanding, and that's what today's event is all about, but what kind of organizations are organizing to get these resources out there. I think, a lot of you have heard of some of these organizations that were doing everything from getting PPE distributed to healthcare and medical centers. They were getting food boxes to elders, and they were distributing financial resources to different community organizations. So there was so much going on, and we wanted to at least just get a snapshot from those themselves who were really working in these different spaces. And we looked at that from these perspectives that you see on the screen. Next slide. And finally, what we learned from what we were able to gather in this report were 5 calls to action that we really wanted to share with the philanthropic sector. And we hope that this is just the beginning of a conversation with the philanthropic sector about what they should be learning about how tribal communities are organizing during the COVID crisis. But more importantly, as we move forward together, how should this be affecting the way that the philanthropic sector is investing in our future, in our everyday lives, and in the kinds of systems change that we really need. We really need to invest in Native-led organizations and initiatives. This entire report focuses on our people leading our own work, and that's super important. Maximizing general operating support. We saw a flurry of important decisions by funders to take what was restricted funding and to unrestrict that funding so that communities could do what they needed immediately. But this should be the case more often. We've been making this case for a long time that Native people and the organizations they lead know how to use that funding best, and that should really be as flexible as possible. Diversify vehicles of it for investment. We are not actually experts at NAP about the future of platforms like GoFundMe, but we did want to highlight and recognize the need for those kinds of platforms, and that they were clearly something that were available for Native people, particularly to reach out to Native and non-people to immediately get resources to the ground through a variety of different kinds of organizations and grassroots efforts. And you'll hear a little bit more about that today. So we need funders to really look at how they are getting those dollars to the ground, what kinds of vehicles exist or should exist. Invest in Indigenous community strengths and leadership, not their deficit. One of the most important things we tried to do with this report was to let Native people step forward with their strengths and not their deficits and their challenges. Too often the philanthropic sector focuses, especially in disaster situations, on our problems and our challenges, and that is not the way forward for our communities. We know the kinds of strengths that our ancestors and our cultures bring to the table, and that's what funders really need to be focusing on if they really care about long-term and sustainable change for our communities. And finally, we didn't have time to go into the details of this here, but so many of the challenges that we faced, especially in the COVID crisis, are a result of many years of failed policy issues in our communities. We have a unique nation-to-nation relationship with the federal government that is grounded in treaties that our ancestors fought for, and the federal government has too often failed in everything from education to healthcare. And our call to action with philanthropy is not that the federal government should be filling in all these dollars and philanthropy doesn't have a role. Instead, we really urge philanthropy to think differently about how they're investing in our leadership so that we have more advocates fighting to protect that nation-to-nation relationship, to ensure that systems change, and to hold the federal government accountable to its role in funding what it's supposed to be funding in our treaty relationships. So that's really a way to shine a spotlight on the importance of investing in policy and policy leadership by Native people. So those are our main calls to action. Please do explore the rest in the report, and we've got our staff answering any questions that you've got online, so please do feel free to do that. But we're going to go ahead and jump into our panel conversation. So I'm really excited to be able to have some of the folks that we interviewed for this project. I want to give a big shout out to my staff, an incredible staff that's been working so hard since the beginning of this pandemic, and particularly Joe Little, who did a lot of the work on this report and a lot of the interviews that really helped lift up and give platform to the voices that you're about to hear from. I'm actually going to go ahead and ask each of our panelists to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about who you are and how you come to the work. And, you know, what have you learned from the work that you've been doing as you've been responding to the COVID crisis in tribal communities in the way that you have? And we'll go ahead and start with Krystal.
Hey, yeah, it's A. Good afternoon, everybody. Shaya Krystal Curley and Inshia. Kenya Ani Nashline, Kentley Chini, Bushes Chain, Nakadine Dashache, and Hanagatni Dashanella. My name is Krystal, and I come from a community called Chachalta, and we're located about 20 miles south of Gallup, and we're just like right in the middle of Gallup and Zuni reservations. And right now it's snowing, so it's such a beautiful moment right now. Beautiful way to start off the year talking about these conversations. I think this is the first step in healing. But I'm the director of a nonprofit called Indigenous Lifeways, and we've been around for about 30 years now. We're called the Southwest Indigenous Uranium Farm, but within the past 5 years, we were able to officially become a 501c3, and it's only because of the needs that we saw in our community. For Indigenous Lifeways, we've been focusing a lot on uranium issues for the past, over 30 years now. And in McKinley County, in Gallup, about 5 miles from Gallup, is a community called Church Rock. And that community has one of the largest uranium mill spills in the 1970s. And so we work closely with community members in that area. And most recently, we started working around issues around domestic violence and sexual abuse. And we see a correlation in between the destruction of our Mother Earth and the violence that we see on our women. And it's a direct correlation. Whatever happens to our Mother Earth, it happens to our women. And it's how would I say this? We've been experiencing crisis before the pandemic, and we're wanting to heal now. We're wanting to start talking about these things that are hurting us for generations and getting to the root causes of everything. So that's what we try and do at Indigenous Lifeways. We try and, center all of our work around ceremony, around our Indigenous ways of life. That's what we try and instill in everything that we do. We do a lot of work around traumatic issues. So it's really important that when we do this type of work that we ground it in ceremony. And we've been helping not just our local communities here in Gallup, but also coast to coast. We've been helping communities pretty much from like Alaska to Hawaii, from Montana to Utah to Arizona. And all of these communities are affected by extraction industries. And they're on sacred sites. A lot of these mines, a lot of these companies are wanting to develop on sacred sites. And so we've been helping several communities in carrying on traditional ceremonies and also demonstrating why it's important to protect our sacred sites. So thank you so much. That's a nutshell on what we do, but thank you.
It's wonderful. Thank you, Krystal, for sharing all of that. And I think, what I most loved about hearing from all of you is just how this story continues about how your organizations and your initiatives are growing in all these different ways. It's great. Olivia, I'm going to turn to you next. Can you tell us a little bit about who you are and the kind of work that you do and what you've been learning?
Yeah, no, I just appreciate being asked to be part of this, and that, you know, the highlight of being with Diné woman is pretty amazing. So Olivia Ronhorse, Yen She, Tone and Ishleen, Twitchini, Bushichin, Tabai, Dashiche, Touchini, Dashinella. We're very fortunate. I work for an Indigenous woman-owned consulting firm called Roanhorse Consulting, which works out well for me. So my twin sister started the firm 5 years ago. I think we're 5 years anniversary this month, really on her own, because she saw a gap, that there wasn't an opportunity and a place for her to really, as a Native woman and a new business owner, to talk about some of the challenges that she faced in starting her own business. And just actually, she has an incredible story that I hope you guys get to hear. So I joined the firm just recently, a year ago, but before that I worked for d.b.a, the Third Foundation, for 7 years, really in that intermediary role of working with other Native nonprofits and organizations. And my background's in public health. So in our firm, we have some really amazing conversations about the health and wealth connection, and also centering our work. And I really appreciate Krystal saying this, but like, once you frame the problem based on the fact that we've gone through hundreds of years of oppression, marginalization, and lack of power and resources, which, you know, Krystal talked about structural violence too in women, but natural resources, and the fact that we, you know, the land was never really truly paid for, and we've never seen any of those things. I think once that's the foundation, we can talk about what are the long-term impacts of that. And in public health, there's many. When we think about like place of where we live, learn, grow, live, play, and the COVID pandemic just made it so hard to watch and hear some of that work. So in our work at the firm, we support a lot of Native-led nonprofits as they're navigating these pathways, and we're fortunate to work with Krystal and learn about Navajo Solidarity Relief. So, well, our role is a little bit different with Native business owners, and then also a resource map that we created to really serve as like a place to uplift existing grassroots and Native-led efforts across New Mexico and Navajo, because we don't want to be a gatekeeper of information. We actually want to share that thoughtfully. Sorry. So I'll stop there and go ahead and turn it over to Shandiin.
Shandiin, you're up next.
Hello, everyone. Yat Shandiin Herrera Yanishia, Tachini Nishla, Nakaith Bahe Bashishim, but Ani Dashiche, Nakaith Bahe Dashanella, Ahot Ao Edina Nishla, Arot Sabin Sky Danasha. Hello, everyone. Thank you, Eric, for inviting me. I'm so excited to be a part of this discussion. My name is Shandiin Herrera. I'm 23 years old, and I currently live in Monument Valley, Utah, here on the Navajo Nation. I graduated in 2019 with my bachelor's in public policy from Duke University. I was able to return home to the Navajo Nation through the Lead for America Hometown Fellowship, and served my first year working with our tribal government here. So I worked with the Ojito chapter as a policy analyst and project consultant. And now I currently work with the Navajo and Hopi Families COVID-19 Relief Fund. I serve as our distribution lead here in Monument Valley, so coordinating our kinship box program, which is our food distribution program, as well as our PPE pantries. And I'm also launching some of our youth programs. So we just finished up doing a winter clothing drive, and we have a monthly coloring contest for our youth that run in the Navajo Times. But primarily my role has been, I started with our original 12 Diné women and Hopi women who founded this organization, and have been a part ever since. We're going on 11 months now. So I also serve as a board member, as well as, one of our staff members on the ground. And so we've been so fortunate to, mobilize quickly and respond to our community's needs. So since our inception in March of last year, we've provided direct relief to over 63,000 households with elders, immunocompromised, and individuals with children. So that is a rough estimate to over 250,000 individuals, which is more than the combined population of the Navajo Nation and Hopi Reservation. We have been successful in serving all 12 Hopi villages as well as other satellite Hopi communities. And we've provided our relief services in 93 of the 110 Navajo chapter communities. So that spans across Arizona, New Mexico, and here in Utah. Our PPE program, we're in our 10th week now. So we've distributed approximately 45,000 PPE kits to our community members. So that includes, face masks, Clorox wipes, and hand sanitizer. And so we've been doing a lot of work these past couple of months to protect our community members and make sure that they have, the adequate resources to shelter in place and stay home. And that is really our goal, is just to support our community members and show up in any way. So for us, that's providing kinship boxes and PPE and launching some future programs to promote just, health and well-being, definitely past COVID. So I'll stop there, but that's just a little bit of the work that we've been doing. Thank you.
Yeah, it's amazing just how much you all have been doing, and just watching that grow and develop in such a tough time. I've just drawn so much inspiration just seeing the photos of what's happening and just hearing from people like you, Shandiin. Thank you so much. Negeen, I'm going to turn to you next. So one of the voices that we wanted to hear in this conversation too was someone coming from the funding community, especially those we work with. And I met you through our Native Voices Rising collaborative, which we were able to actually provide all of the organizations that we were funding through that fund with flat funding this year through a number of different philanthropic organizations like yourself. And so we really wanted to hear from you. Tell us a little bit about who you are and what brings you to the work, and what are you learning? What kinds of things are coming up for you as you're working with tribal communities?
Yeah, thank you so much, Eric. And good morning, everyone. I'm Nagin Darani. Really appreciate this opportunity to have this important conversation, and really excited to hear more from Krystal, Olivia, and Shandiin. I'm based in the Bay Area on unceded Ramaytush Ohlone land. I'm the Senior Director of Programs at the 11th Hour Project, which, if you're not familiar, is the grant-making arm of the Schmidt Family Foundation. And I guess that question, Eric, of why we're doing this work, as a funder, we focus on climate and human rights issues domestically and internationally, primarily through the frames of food and energy systems. And, we talk a lot internally about the interconnectedness of things, the interconnectedness of all living things. It's such a key way in which we think about the work we do. And it's not lost on us how much this worldview draws from Indigenous wisdom about the relationship between people and planet. And very much thinking about what Krystal just shared with us, it's also not lost on us that Indigenous communities are both the front lines of defense and the most impacted by extractive industries. You're the boldest advocates of and stewards for grassroots climate solutions. So I feel like if any funders are focused on climate change and human rights issues, the imperative is really clear. In as philanthropy, we can probably do more and better, I think. And COVID is just a devastating reminder of that. Eric, did you want me to speak a little bit about some of the lessons that we've learned right now, or I wasn't sure if you wanted me to save that for later?
Yes, sure. Go ahead. Thank you.
I guess like the biggest lesson for us, and it was well highlighted in the NAP report, was that, as part of the funder community, we need to keep moving from reaction to proaction. Definitely need to move from a deficits-based frame to an assets-based one. The real work is happening at the grassroots, and we're excited to hear more from fellow panelists, on the ground, and we just need to be good partners and allies along the way. We established a cross-program initiative on Indigenous communities in 2018. So we're still very new to the work. We're still very much learning. We're deeply grateful to our Indigenous partners who've helped us with that. And at its core, it really is about building relationships, building trust. And we heard in the beautiful initial blessing to this call, the gift of listening, deep listening. And I think, as we all know, these things are really hard to do in a crisis context and with a crisis mindset. So, you know, a lot of our work happened actually before COVID that set the stage for being responsive. We established a small grants rapid response carve out of our total Indigenous budget, where we committed to a set of streamlined processes, mostly in the form of donations. So no proposals, no reporting, general operating support, fast-tracked within our grants management system, really just to get the dollars out. And then we use this fund for wildfires and other natural disasters, but mostly in 2020 for COVID. You know, while far from perfect in deciding how to allocate those funds, we really leaned into our existing relationships with Indigenous organizations. So for example, we are, and you mentioned this at the beginning of the call, we're proud funders of Native Voices Rising, which is focused on strengthening support to grassroots groups led by and for Native communities and its community-led decision-making. You know, we asked Native Americans in Philanthropy and Common Council for your guidance on organizations that might be needing extra help in this time. We greatly benefited from your ear to the ground, as well as that of other partners like First Nations Development Institute. And we tried to focus on geographies where our foundation's already deep and local in our other programs, to hold the possibility that, you know, beyond COVID, we could start to build those deeper relationships. So, you know, continuing to hold that hope that one day soon we can actually visit each other and be in right relationship out of Zoom. So that was one piece. And then on the pro-action side, just, you know, building the infrastructure. And again, that was really beautifully set out in the report. You know, there's this incredibly rich Indigenous-led philanthropy ecosystem, a quickly growing nonprofit ecosystem that just needs better resourcing. And, you know, for someone who's worked in crisis response in other contexts, that's the greatest and most powerful buffer against these crisis moments. And I wouldn't in any way claim to be comprehensive, but I just wanted to share out, you know, in addition to NAP, other phenomenal organizations, I mentioned First Nations Development Institute, but NDN Collective, Indigenous Environmental Network, Colorado Plateau Foundation, Seventh Generation Fund, Cultural Survival. A lot of these organizations are on NAP's website as well. And there are others, but you know, you're all actively building out the social sector infrastructure to address the disproportionate inequities. And as I think Olivia said, you know, dealt by the history of our country and laid bare by COVID. And these, you know, these organizations have rich theories of change, tremendous and visionary staff, generating the research, the data, the agenda. Some are doing the capacity building and training sessions. It's all laid out there. And then through that regranting, what we've tried to do, and I think it's really helpful for others to consider, is just begin to build from those regranting relationships to have deeper relationships with particular nonprofits and local communities, so that you can directly support communities in their expression of their self-determination. It's super hard because we can't travel to build these relationships, but I think these are important and possible first steps. And then lastly, I'd just say, you know, there's a lot of great goodwill to take like the next step for action. You know, if you're unsure, reaching out to NAP, reaching out to any of us on the call today, our fellow funders, so that we can help make introductions and connections, and just, I think, really important, build on what we're all learning and not having to start from scratch. So yeah, those are my lessons in a nutshell.
Great, thank you so much, Negeen. And yes, I couldn't agree more with being able to be in community and in person again as part of our work. So crucial. You know, building off of what you mentioned, Negeen, about this Indigenous ecosystem, I'm going to go to you next, Krystal. You know, many of the funders that we work with every day are born out of, you know, a tax structure and these rigid ways of doing business. And, you know, a lot of our work at NAP is trying to figure out how to work around it, but also push back on it as much as possible, because there's, you know, organizations like yours approach this from such an Indigenous standpoint. So you really infuse the values in your work and how you're gathering and sharing resources. Can you tell us a little bit more about your approach to meeting the crisis, but also, what are some of the kind of day-to-day ways that you are identifying resources, sharing them with your community, and what should funders learn from that?
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I think that's such an important question to start asking our communities, and how can we be better organizers among ourselves, among our families, among all of these existing systems that are out there. And for us at Indigenous Lifeways, we are really grounded again in the power of ke, and ke in Navajo is family. And for us, again, I really think it's our success of Mckinley Mutual Aid, all the efforts that we've done. I really strongly believe it's because of our existing relationships and our partnerships that we've had for over 30 years. And, Seventh Generation Fund, Native Americans in Philanthropy, you guys were, and you guys were one of the very first funders that really kickstarted Mckinley Mutual Aid. And again, that goes back to, it's going from Indigenous-led organizations back, our funders, and going to Indigenous-led organizations, getting to the grassroots. And I feel like that was the biggest outcome is the support of other Indigenous-led organizations and funders, foundations. I really believe that because of Indigenous people in philanthropy, I really feel like their insight and knowing our communities, knowing how it is on the reservations, they were really able to make it more rapid response. From our experience, it was very streamlined process. And that's what we really needed at the time when we first started coming together as a community. We knew that there was a need for food. There's all these lack of access to grocery stores, to clean water, to housing for people who didn't even have transportation, that don't even have electricity. So there's all these barriers, and even having access to healthcare, that's another issue. And there's so many barriers, and I feel like all of the partners that are in Mckinley Mutual Aid, we know our community, we know the families, and I feel like when we know what we're up against, we know what the solutions are. And it was just coming together quickly as a very organic collaboration. We quickly organized back in March when we were experiencing our first lockdown for New Mexico. And it was, there were so many lessons learned. At the beginning, we experienced racism because I am Navajo, and I live, near a border town of Gallup and of Farmington, and those are border towns that are right on the Navajo Nation. And even trying to get food, when we first started in a U-Haul, we were denied food because I, had my Indigenous Lifeways debit card, and I'd go in and I'm buying, these couple shopping carts for food for my community. And at that time there was restrictions. So they're like, no, you can't take that. You can't take that. Put that away, put all those 30 cans of Span back. So it was to me, that was like so heartbreaking. But luckily, my colleague at the time, she was white and she had her own nonprofit, and she was like our gateway person of getting through this racist culture that we have in our border towns on getting food. So she was able to break through those barriers. And we recognized that we had to start thinking more strategically on how to get food that's more how would you say it? Just more quantity. We had to, just buy more food to make sure that we had food for that week. So it pushed us to gather more resources outside of McKinley County. We helped get a production streamline food chain to Gallup through Bain and Keith productions or food distribution. So they were they're very small company, but they really try to localize their food sources. So at the beginning, we really tried to make our food boxes culturally appropriate, because where I'm from in Gallup, we're not just Navajo, we're Zuni, we're mixed status, we're undocumented, there's so many cultures here in McKinley County, but we recognize that the most impacted communities were our Navajo relatives, our elders, our immune compromised folks, and also our Zuni relatives, and again, our mixed status relatives here in McKinley County that didn't have access to the stimulus check, or they were laid off. So there were so many different populations that we were trying to serve. And again, there's a lot of land jurisdiction as well. In my city of Gallup, there's about 17 land statuses just in McKinley County or in Gallup. And so there's so many different checkerboards, so many different barriers that we have to navigate to get resources out. And even when national or international organizations came in, like CORE Response and World Central Kitchen, when they came in, there were certain places they couldn't go because of jurisdiction issues. So we were able to collaborate with those organizations and continue to bring more resources out, not just food boxes, but also their hygiene kits that were very helpful. We were also doing cases of water as well because of the lack of access to clean water. But I really believe that the power of partnerships, our existing relationships, knowing our barriers, knowing what we're up against is what really set the foundation for our success on helping and being there for our community members. We were able to help out a little over 7,000 families with food boxes. That number may change if you count, all the grandmas and all the aunties and the nieces and nephews and kids, grandkids in the household. But we, really tried to get to those communities that were hard to reach. The ones that really didn't have transportation. And there's so many different things on why Gallup was hit the hardest. Again, we're a border town. So before COVID, every first of the month, I'm trying to paint a picture here for you on why we were hit the hardest in McKinley County, why Navajo Nation was hit the hardest is because we don't have access to grocery stores. So in Gallup, before COVID, every first of the month, because a lot of our population is on federal assistance, a lot of the grandmas that get their Social Security money first and the third of the month of every month. So the first weekend in Gallup, every single month, it never ends. Even during COVID, our population here in Gallup triples from like 30,000 to maybe 80,000 above. And these are families that are organizing among themselves to get rides and to get into the community, to get into Gallup to get their resources. So when you don't have a vehicle, you don't have groceries, you don't have food to feed your animals, you have to figure it out somehow. You have to survive. So that's why our numbers increase, is because of that lack of infrastructure, so many lack of infrastructure. But thank you so much, Eric.
No, thank you. I really appreciate it. I think, understanding, what it really looks like on the ground is really important. One of the things that you mentioned, Krystal, was about businesses, and it made me think about some of the work that Olivia and her team have been doing. Olivia, can you tell us a little bit about what you've been learning in your work with Native small business and how they've been impacted, what you're trying to do to support them, because I think we've already heard, how important it is that we have a thriving Native business infrastructure too.
Sure, and I'm going to be upfront about probably not giving it the best response, just because I'm still learning those parts. But what I can say is businesses were hard hit, not just, when people think, generic businesses and food places, we're talking about small Native owned businesses. And many of those, and we actually, did a survey, we meaning Native Women Lead, which two of my colleagues, Jamie Glochet and Vanessa, are co-founders. And they've brought together Native women businesses together for several years over events to really talk about, from an Indigenous lens, what do women entrepreneurs who naturally fit what they call the backbone of their families and communities, and also are the breadwinners and bread makers of their communities. So they did do some surveys about like what happened soon after COVID hit. And some of these businesses talked about like how 71% of those who responded, that was their sole income. So when COVID hit, that's a huge impact to these smaller businesses that couldn't be, totally quantified because some of them are not LLC structured, but are just working straight out of their home, delivering to their community members things that they're asking for. So part of what Native Women Lead did is partner with Nusenda, which is a credit union here in New Mexico, to work with their co-op capital program, which is, and I've never heard of this before, it's pretty amazing to me, but it's a relationship-based lending pilot. So instead of focusing on things that we know a lot of people of color don't have access to and actually discriminated against when it comes to lending dollars, it's based on relationships. It's based on, their passion and interest. It's based on their character. It's not about a credit score. And so they partnered with Nusenda and were able to do some smaller loans. And these were at 0% financed, which is incredible. It was going to be focused for Native businesses in general, but when COVID hit, it was right around that same time that they launched this. And so they turned more to whatever emergency needs small business owners needed. And it was between $2,000 and $5,000. And I just got word yesterday that 2 of their loans that they gave out are fully paid. They have a 0% default rate, which is amazing. So there are these systems that are kind of pushing back on existing systems. And really that's what these grassroots and community-led organizations are doing. They're pushing back to say, we know what our communities need. We know how our communities need them. And our Indigenous communities have been organizing forever. They never stopped organizing. And so I think this idea of like an organization doing something, they've been doing it. It just so happens now they have a name or they have a funding structure that's connected to them, but they've always been doing this work. So that's one thing I wanted to share. Then the other thing is Indian country is not a project. Vanessa said this the other day and I was like, dang, high five, woman. And we were on a call. So I was like, yeah, but it's not a project. It's a long-term investment. And so I think that's challenging because there's so many things infrastructure-wise that have an impact on the causal pathway of our health. I'm the public health person. The perfect example is weathering or allostatic load. That cumulative stress over time, which is historical trauma, has an impact on our physiology, which makes us more prone to chronic illnesses like diabetes and hypertension. And then that impacts how COVID had comorbidities. So I think all of those pieces means like, yes, build that relationship. Yes, get connected. Yes, don't walk away too soon. Yes, make an actual commitment, like Northwest Area Foundation said, we're going to commit X amount of dollars of our entire asset to Native communities, and not just make it about, whenever we have money or how we can do it, because that shows Native communities there's a commitment there. So I did a little bit of both, Eric, sorry.
No, that was great. And I also am writing down Indian country is not a project. I love that because it's so true. I'm actually going to go to one of our questions from the audience because I think it goes really well to, I know, your experience, Shandiin. One of the other things we call for in the report, and I have worked in policy for a lot of my life, is funders really need to be investing more in policy, and that doesn't always just mean some, research wonk here in Washington, D.C. It means grassroots organizing, and it means the kinds of organizations that are resource networks, but they're also making policy change. So one of our questions, Shandiin, I thought I'd throw to you is, thinking of native vote overlay during 2020, do you see opportunities as organizers for building community members' capacity to advocate for policy change, which can advance Indigenous health, power, and strategies?
Yeah, no, I think that is a great question. And that's something we often, in our day-to-day meetings here is, think about the longevity of what we're doing, right? Like we, yes, are constantly figuring out remedies for COVID's daily impacts in our communities, but we're also thinking about, okay, what about 5 years down the road, 10 years? What is this going to look like? And like what was mentioned earlier, is a lot of what we've been seeing is a direct result of failed policies and not having Native people at the table when these decisions that gravely affect our community are made. And so, we're thinking about, okay, not only just figuring out today's issues, but how are we going to foster our own advocates and our leadership? And so, yes, I think this is such an amazing opportunity for that. And I do want to mention as well that I think this is a really great opportunity to start incorporating Native youth. Eric, we met through the Center for Native American Youth Champions for Change program. And that was my first experience really in DC among other Native youth who are amazing advocates for their community, but also an opportunity where, we were able to sit down with Senator Romney, who is the senator here in Utah, and really talk about, what are the issues here in Monument Valley? What do I want to see from leadership? How can we continue to heal our communities? And so I think that a big part of that is redefining what these policy engagements are, but also redefining what we think as leadership. And so, I think a big part of that is making space for more Native voices, but particularly more Native youth voices. And is one of the main reasons that, I decided to come back home. I think my generation is consistently looking for ways to become involved and invested. And we're so invested in coming home and rebuilding our communities, but it's extremely difficult. There aren't a lot of opportunities, especially in reservation communities, for our youth, which interestingly, because, we are constantly told, go to college, go to school and come back and help your people. And so when I came back, I'm like, okay, I went to college, I'm ready to help. And there wasn't a position, there wasn't, any type of space created yet. So I saw this as an opportunity to forge a pathway for that, and, co-founded our first cohort of Lead for America Hometown Fellows that, myself and my amazing friend Amara, who's part of the Salish Kootenai tribe, were the first 2 Native women in this organization to really talk about how are we going to get more Native youth home, because I think this year especially, we've seen how much we need our Native youth here. We've seen Native youth step up to work on the front lines, to deliver care packages to elders, to create systems of communication, to teach our peers, our families how to use Zoom, how to move their businesses online, to sell their jewelry so that they can have some type of income throughout this pandemic. So, it's really exciting for me, as a 23-year-old to be in this space and to bring my peers along with me. I've had a lot of Native youth from other communities throughout this country reach out to me asking for advice and guidance on how to become involved or even initiate a similar program where they're helping their community. And having this experience allows me to provide that mentorship, but also I think it helps, our, older generation to see that we're here and that we are ready to, work with our communities in any way that's needed. And so I think when we talk about long-term policy change and leadership, that's also a conversation about how we are going to create space for more Native youth, and how we're going to not just, encourage youth to go off and then come home, but make sure that they have, an opportunity to come home to. So I think that has also been, a big part of my journey, is not just, thinking about today's issues and challenges, but, how are we going to include policy leadership, but also making sure we're being inclusive in who is at the table for these decisions. And, our decisions today are really going to impact generations to come. And so I think it's really important to have the diversity in terms of the perspective and how we plan going forward. Thank you.
That's awesome, and just such an inspiring note. And I really felt that just in being with you on the Hill for one day, and sort of what's going on out there. Believe it or not, we are already at the end of our hour. I was hoping we'd have a little bit more time for conversation, but I think these perspectives were just so powerful and rich. There's so much more to explore. So I just wanted to, first of all, thank our panelists for taking time to be here with us today and to share your insights and wisdom, and to support the work of this report. Like I said, we really want this report to be just the beginning of many conversations. I also want to invite our audience to please share ideas with us and our team about how we can build on this conversation, especially as we're talking about bringing the philanthropic sector into our conversations about the future of our communities. How can we drive that kind of investment? I think you've heard the rich ways that our networks are developing to raise and get resources to the ground, to support business, to invest in policy change. It's not just one structure, I think is one of the biggest takeaways here, that we really need to look to the diverse ways that our communities are doing this work. And I hope that you heard a little bit about that today, but you can find out more in our report that's available at our website. We also have a link to the slide deck, a more extended version of the slide deck, if you'd like to share that. And if you'd like to be connected with anyone here in our networks, please reach out anytime. And just want to thank you all for joining us today.